Now that we've explored the background of the Vikings and the Viking activity in Gwynedd, we can now move on to other Welsh kingdoms. Now moving on to the next kingdom, Powys. The history of this kingdom during the Viking period is difficult to show, as by the middle of the 9th century, Powys had endured decades of repeated attacks and raids by the English kingdoms, specifically from Mercia. The last independent king of Powys in the early Middle Ages died in exile in Rome in 856. The kingdom would either be conquered or united through diplomacy by the king of Gwynedd, Rhodri the Great. Powys would not become an independent kingdom again until 2 centuries later, in the High Middle Ages. As for Viking activity in Powys during the early Middle Ages, due to the location of Powys, and perhaps Offa's Dyke played a role in protecting Powys, or at that point in history the dyke may have fallen into disrepair. We have hardly any information on Vikings in Powys, although the Battle of Buttington is the battle where the Welsh and English kingdoms joined forces to defeat a Viking warband. So it's plausible that the men of Powys would have fought in that joint army. Britannia. Due to the landlocked territory of the kingdom, Britannia didn't suffer as many raids by the Vikings as the Welsh kingdoms with coastal territories did, although the kingdom did suffer from the large-scale raid of the Norsemen in the raid of 896, which included other kingdoms such as Gwent. But for the kingdom of Britannia, the attacks by the Norsemen was not the biggest threat to the kingdom's independence. That came from Gwynedd and Mercia. The small amount of information we have on the threat comes from the Welsh monk Asa, who was the biographer of King Alfred of Wessex. He tells us that the kingdom sought the aid of King Alfred, but how far this protection went ended when Alfred's daughter, Ethelfled, Lady of the Mercians, attacked the kingdom. To what extent of an attack on the kingdom, we don't know, and for the reasons we can speculate. The Anglosaxon Chronicles tell us about the attack. 916, in this year before midsummer, on June 16th, the day of the festival of St. Quinaris, the martyr, Abbot Egbert, who had done nothing to deserve it, was slain together with his companions. 3 days later, Ethelfled sent an army into Wales and stormed Britannia, and there captured the wife of the king and 33 other persons. In the 930s, the independence of the kingdom was lost again, as Hywel Dda, king of Deheubarth, took control of the kingdom after the last king's death. The kingdom of Gwent. Like Britannia, Gwent suffered from the Norse raid of 896, but the kingdom was subject to a series of raids from 850 onwards. But information from this kingdom is scarce. The Vikings did reappear in 916 and raided the coast of southeast Wales, which would include Gwent, but this Viking band went further into England, attacking around Gloucestershire and Herefordshire. The frustrating issue regarding Gwent is that information about the kingdom over the centuries is that Welsh sources really pay little attention to Gwent during the Viking Age. One reason springs to mind is that because of Gwent's capitulation towards King Alfred of Wessex, this action in turn reduced the kingdom to a petty kingdom or vassal state of Wessex, which the kingdom may have had little choice given the aggression from other Welsh kingdoms. However, we lack the details on the agreement between Wessex and the southeast Welsh kingdoms. Like Powys, Gwent was bordering the English kingdoms, which slowly weakened Gwent against the increasing power of Wessex and later the Kingdom of England. Glywysing. This kingdom's history is often tied with Gwent, as over the centuries the two would form the Kingdom of Morgannwg. The Viking raid of 896 affected areas of Glywysing as well. In 850, we know that the Vikings raided Cardiff and would later settle and trade in areas around Cardiff, possibly using the old Roman fort as a base. The extent of Viking settlements around the Cardiff area was significant enough that several place names are derived from the Norse. How the kings of Glywysing acted towards these attacks and settlements is unknown. The threat of attacks from the Mercians in the 880s was enough that the kingdom sought the protection of Wessex and would later fight alongside Wessex against the Vikings. By the 10th century, the kingdom would ally or submit to King Aethelstan of the newly created Kingdom of England. The Kingdom of Deheubarth is a fusion kingdom consisting of the Kingdom of Ceredigion, Dyfed and Brycheiniog. This kingdom was created in 920 during the Viking Age. Before the kingdom's creation, the Vikings had already created a presence in South Wales with trading stations along the coast. We've looked at the Vikings in Welsh sources as well as Irish and English ones. We do have some Viking sources on Wales. One from the High Middle Ages, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, tells us this. In that book on the reckoning of time, which the Venerable Bede drew up, there is mention made of the island called Thule, which in books is said to be 6 days sailing north from Bretland. Bretland is what the Norse called Wales. Some of the other Norse sources on Wales simply mention accounts of raiding parts of Wales along with other parts of Albion and Ireland, although there is a tale of a Norseman marrying a Welsh princess and gaining half of his new father-in-law's lands. Going back to Viking activity in South Wales, archaeological evidence of Viking settlement show us that there were silver-crafted goods containing ingots and Scandinavian as well as Anglo-Saxon coins dating from the 11th century. Although most of the archaeological evidence we have from Wales is mainly focused on Bronze Age Wales, Roman Britain and the early Welsh kingdoms from 400 to 700 AD, there is very little for Viking settlements in Wales. Although that doesn't mean Vikings didn't settle in Wales, they did and worked as traders, as an Irish source mentions Welsh horses being traded, yet slaves would be the most lucrative source of revenue for the Vikings. Before Dyfed was a part of Deheubarth in the 10th century, the kingdom had lost lands to Ceredigion around the 750s, weakening it and making it ripe for raiding by the Vikings sailing around the Irish Sea in the next century. The coastal city of Swansea is an interesting point for history about Vikings in Wales. Although we have no written records of Viking settlements in Swansea, there are place names. The lack of information on settlements can be attributed to the lack of funding for research and archaeology. The document, A Research Framework for the Archaeology of Wales, explains the reasons. To quote a small part of the entire document, although a very small number of new early medieval sites, including non-elite secular settlements, has been identified and their potential confirmed, owing to the lack of funding, the only ones being investigated more extensively are those subject to developer funding. Returning to Vikings in Dyfed, one place that saw plenty of attacks was the Cathedral of St. David, Dewi Sant. One of the holiest places in Wales meant nothing to the pagan Vikings. The monastery at St. David's would be sacked plenty of times during the Viking Age. The attacks that occurred at St. David's were not always done by the Norse. They would still attack the site and the surrounding area plenty of times over the course of the Viking Age. One notable raid in 999 AD saw the Vikings kill the Bishop of St. David. The killing of such a high-ranking bishop is odd, as the Norse would have made money ransoming the bishop. One case of the Norse ransoming members of the clergy was in 914. A Viking fleet with Norsemen from South Wales and Dublin sailed into the Bristol Channel and kidnapped a group of clergymen. The situation was resolved by King Edward of Wessex, whose army later drove out the Vikings from the Bristol Channel. The raids on St. David took their toll, as the site would be abandoned for several years. In an ironic twist, the Normans, the French-speaking Vikings who settled in Normandy, France around the early 10th century, who then took over England in 1066, would be the ones who protected and built the current cathedral. Yet the Vikings would attack and destroy plenty of monasteries in Wales. The ascension of Roesdahl and the creation of the Kingdom of Deheubarth gave stability to southwest Wales, as the kingdoms under Roesdal's rule would work together against any Norse attacks or raids. The peace within his kingdoms must have been set, as in 929 Roesdahl left Wales for a pilgrimage to Rome. The frequency of Viking attacks in his kingdom declined until his death in 950. The kingdoms unified under Roesdahl were independent again. The fighting that followed between the Welsh kingdoms over the course of the next decades left the kingdoms in Wales open to Viking attacks once again, with sporadic raids over the next decades, even when the power of Deheubarth was recreated by King Maredudd after his conquest of Gwynedd. The Vikings still raided heavily into Wales up until the High Middle Ages, and certainly had an impact on Welsh history, helping to forge the tales of some of the great kings of Wales, whose history we will explore next.